This is Billie Tarascio with the Modern Divorce Podcast. So excited to be here with you all today to discuss one of your most pressing topics, sexual health, psychosexual evaluations, deviant sexual behavior, all the good stuff. And we are bringing with us a local expert, Dr. Jessica Leclerc. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's so great to have you here. Let's start with how do you get into this sort of field?
By chance. I went in to become a psychologist so I could do evaluations primarily because I like evaluations more than conducting therapy. Really the reason why is because I like to be like Sherlock Holmes and kind of find all the pieces of the puzzle and put it together and then really inform the court kind of what's going on with any individual and what needs to happen to help them change whatever is going on that is problematic in their life at the moment. I've always wanted to be in forensics, so that was never a problem there because there's lots of evaluations that are needed in the forensic realm. Definitely. And I just sort of fell into sexual deviancy and doing psychosexual evaluations for both the juveniles and adults.
Yeah. Okay. So there are so many things that we could talk about. You do psychological assessments, you do psychosexual assessments. Let's talk about psychosexual evaluations, because what is that?
What is that? That is a good question. So when they are ordered by the court, there's really some sort of allegation of some sort of sexual deviancy or sexually problematic behavior for the individual. And essentially there's a question of what's going on with this person, what's their behavior look like, and how does that impact in case of family court, impact their ability to parent. So what typically happens is we do a detailed clinical interview that covers your entire life. That also gets done for a psychological evaluation. So in that case, they're similar. Mm-hmm. The only difference with this interview is that we go into all of your sexual behaviors as well in much more detail about pornography use, masturbation practices, any sort of sexual behavior you've ever engaged in, all the details about your partners. So there's a lot more that gets covered than a psychological evaluation. And then we run a number of different tests. The tests are, some of them are also included in psychological evaluation. So general mental health, substance use, if that's a problem, parenting for family court purposes. If there is any sort of trauma history, we'll assess trauma. And any sort of domestic violence or anger issues, we'll assess anger as well. And then with the psychosexual portion, again, we're looking at sexual interests and sexual behaviors. So there's different inventories that we give that people have to rate their arousal patterns to the different sexual scenarios. We also look at what we call cognitive distortions or thinking errors. So basically distorted thinking that supports engaging in maladaptive sexual behavior. There are inventories to assess that as well, so to compare the individual to how similar they are to, let's say, known sex offenders. So all of that gets put together, review all of the records, and if it's a quality evaluation, the evaluator will ensure they review all the records, all the allegations that are going on, pretty much everything that's been presented in evidence, the individual's mental health records if they are available, put all that together, render a diagnosis if there is one, and then provide treatment recommendations.
Okay. So what is to stop someone from just lying?
Well, that happens all the time. Everybody lies, especially in forensic evaluations. There's always a motive to lie. So we have built-in validity indicators on the tests to do that. There's also, well, the longer you do this, the longer you know what's more appropriate and normal versus not normal and somebody's lying. So if a good psychologist will challenge that in the interview to try to catch the person, especially if they change their story, things like that. Frequently, we also include, for adults at least, a polygraph examination, which is the standard for family court. And it cannot be used in criminal court, but it does get used for therapy purposes. And for family court purposes, we're really looking at the allegations there. And frankly, if somebody is outright lying, they're going to get caught up on that. The testing will look funky, and they're not going to present well in the interview either. So putting all those things together, then a psychologist can kind of figure out, okay, there's clearly something going on. The person's being dishonest. We don't necessarily know about what, but they're clearly being not totally truthful. So we would discuss that in the evaluation. If they are being truthful, then they're not going to have any problem passing a polygraph. They're going to be pretty open in their interview, and their testing will come out appropriate.
Okay, so I had heard, and this may be a myth, that you all hook up probes to various members and show them images to measure arousal. So is that a myth?
So, well, it's a myth as it is applied to currently. So that is called the plethysmograph, and that used to be used on convicted sex offenders. It no longer gets used now. There are a few cases for the sex offenders that are committed to the state hospital indefinitely because they're that dangerous, the sexually violent predators. Some of those individuals do get that testing for various reasons, but that's on a case-by-case basis. Overall, the plethysmograph is no longer used. We rely on the polygraph and other sexual interest instruments that are frankly just on the computer. The person's looking at pictures and just typing in answers or whatnot. So it's a lot less invasive.
That is much less invasive.
Yes.
And I think that that's important because it's going to make a court more open to ordering an evaluation when it doesn't include such a physical violation. This is still an emotional and a mental violation, but at least physically you're okay.
Yes. Yeah, it is taxing. My average evaluations last about 8 hours of face-to-face time, and that's with minimal breaks. So a lot of times this can be done over the course of a few days. I typically have the polygraph done on a completely separate day because that can be 2 to 3 hours depending on the person's history. So it is very, very taxing to do, but a proper one is that comprehensive.
Okay, so let's get into some specifics because as a family law attorney, I talk to a lot of clients who have concerns. And what I want to know is we're going to play a little game where I tell you the fact pattern and you tell me whether or not this is something that is concerning. Okay.
Okay.
So fact pattern, wife, and usually I'm just going to say for this particular podcast episode, I'm going to sound very sexist because in my experience, women are concerned about men. And I really have not seen the other way, except if women are prostitutes. And I guess let's start with that. If a woman's a prostitute or a stripper or an OnlyFans, maybe prostitute's the bad term, and I should say sex worker. Is that sexually deviant behavior?
It could be. It depends on if they're in a trauma relationship and they have a pimp. So it's more, I would look more that way where it's more trauma and they're being forced into it. If they are of age, willing participants, they ensure that their child has a safety plan and they're being watched appropriately, the behavior is not occurring in the home, then no, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's going to impact their ability to parent. There are plenty of adult strippers that have children that are really great parents, and they have a good natural support system, and that's fine. My bigger concern is a lot of times those individuals are also using drugs because that type of work can be pretty taxing and substance use usually goes along with it. So in that respect, I'd actually be more concerned about their substance use than necessarily the sexually deviant behavior that could potentially be going on.
Okay. What about multiple partners? multiple intimate relationships, moving in, getting very, very close with people very quickly, and then cycling through relationships. Is that something that you would look at?
So yes, that wouldn't necessarily be under a psychosexual evaluation. We might be able to cover that under a psychological evaluation. It would really depend on what the children are being exposed to. There are plenty of people that live in multiple relationships and do so in a healthy manner, and it doesn't negatively impact the children. But again, if there's porn on the television all the time and they're having sex in the living room and the kids are exposed to that, well, that's a much different story. And unfortunately, that does happen sometimes. So that could be covered under a psychological or a psychosexual, depending on the details. And that's where the records, I personally would want more of the records of the allegations to determine what would be a better evaluation for that.
Okay. What about a polyamorous relationship?
That's the same thing that of the previous one. Can be
Got it.
completely healthy, can be dysfunctional. It depends on what the children are being exposed to and other factors going on in terms of the sexual behaviors.
Okay. So how do you know? So for many people, they would look at a polyamorous relationship and say that is deviant. That's outside the norm. It's not okay with me. Like, why would I want a sex therapist to tell a judge that that was healthy for my ex to do?
So it's outside of the norm based on pretty much religious beliefs. In terms of that's most religions teach marriage and relationships is between one man and one female. But we know now that there are plenty of healthy adults that are two males, two females. There are polyamorous relationships where there are multiple combinations of those, and they're perfectly healthy and fine. It really depends on what's the actual sexual behavior going on and what's being taught to the children. We cannot, as evaluators, we have to remain objective, and we cannot base our opinion off of what a potential religion or what would be the majority of society consider to be deviant. We have to look at what science tells us.
And it sounds like what makes something okay versus not okay, in your opinion, is, do we have consenting adults where no one's being forced to do something against their will?
That is the very main primary factor. And then again, what sexual behaviors are the children being exposed to?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's great, because that kind of gives us a framework. Okay. Let me give you some other fact patterns. A woman tells me that her husband is masturbating in public. Is that deviant?
Yes. That's actually against the law.
Yes.
It's deviant and illegal. So in that respect, a psychosexual evaluation would be recommended clinically.
Can we infer, or how do I make a claim that this is illegal, deviant behavior, and how do I show what impact that has on the child?
Well, that's the purpose of the psychosexual evaluation. So as an attorney, you're going to look at, okay, my client is saying that their soon-to-be ex is engaging in X, Y, and Z behaviors. It's your job to know the law and say, are any of those behaviors illegal? If they are, then we might have to file a police report. We might, if the child was present during any of those, you might have to make a DCS call. But in terms of what those behaviors and how they impact the ability to parent, that is the exact purpose of the psychosexual evaluation, which is why a judge would order that.
Okay. And how do we stop a judge? Well, and this may be more of a lawyer question, but many, many times judges kind of just don't want to hear it and end up ordering equal parenting time. So is there any evidence or statistics that we can use as attorneys to show a judge, no, it really is dangerous? Or is it just our argument?
I think it would depend on how you argue. There is some research. Obviously, if it's illegal behavior, you can solely base it on that. And I would hope that a judge would say, okay, this person is legitimately committing a sex crime, and that's the allegation here, that's potentially not safe to a child. So I would hope you would be able to make that argument, and use some of the data out there for that. But I've had attorneys just call me in as an expert witness to argue and ask these questions of why an evaluation is needed. And that usually has made the judges, once they hear my explanation, then they would order them. I will say that typically when one side, in most of the cases, as we said, it's the fathers getting the psychosexual evaluations, then dad's attorney typically will turn around and say, well, mom's unstable, and then the judge orders a psychological evaluation on mother. So that does happen in a lot of cases as well. And if I'm on the stand, then I would give an opinion if I asked if whether or not that's clinically appropriate.
Got it. Okay, that's great. That's fantastic. Okay. What about, so I could go into specifics, but it sounds like we've got a theme, and the theme is if someone is committing behavior that is either in front of the children, not consensual, or illegal, those are the triggers to get yourself a psychosexual evaluation.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about porn.
Okay.
What amount, what frequency of porn is normal?
So, child porn is never okay. So in child pornography, that happens a lot, unfortunately, now with the internet. And depending if the police get involved or not, because I have had somewhere it's been allegations, but then the evidence has been destroyed. The computer itself was destroyed. So then we can't prosecute, but multiple witnesses can give reports. In that respect, we would definitely ask for a psychosexual evaluation, even though there's not necessarily going to be any criminal charges. In terms of, I want to use the word normal porn or adult porn, I like to conceptualize porn as same way was what we would do with substance use. If it is impacting the person's relationships, their life, their ability to function, they're using it pretty much every day and can't get through the day without it, then that's clearly a problem. If it's not necessarily using it every day, but if they're using it at a frequency where it is being disruptive to relationships, then we would look at that as well. So it really depends on the person. My personal belief on pornography, just because I know a lot about the pornography industry, I'm not a fan of it at all. If you're going to have a healthy relationship, even if you're watching it together as part of your sex practices, there are other ways to stimulate arousal that don't involve supporting that industry, because frankly, a lot of bad comes out of that industry, even if there is consenting adults doing it. But I do realize that other people don't necessarily have that belief, and they use it together with their partners, and it doesn't cause a problem. And that's fine. In that case, it's not deviant and it's not an issue. It becomes an issue when it starts to become problematic in other areas of their life.
All right. And under this fact pattern, the wife is going to be saying, he was watching porn all the time. It was a problem for me. Husband's going to be saying, I had no problem. I'm good to go. Right. So that's one of those cases where you would need more facts, probably.
Would need more facts, and I might recommend in that respect, especially if there's a lot of he said, she said going on, there might actually be some more mental health personality dynamics between the two. In that respect, I might recommend a psychological evaluation for both parents, and then assess in there if there really is a need for a psychosexual evaluation, or if it can just, the pornography usage can be covered under the psychological. So that would be more on a case-by-case basis.
What type of personality disorder or characteristics would lead to that dynamic where
A lot of times we have some antisocial issues going on in some instances where they don't really care about the other person or care about anyone else for that matter. So then we're looking at, okay, how is this impacting the dynamic within the relationship? We could have some narcissism going on, which is very common in family court. We could have some borderline or histrionic traits where it's naturally problems in relationships and the attention needs to be on me. If the attention is not on me, that causes a problem. So that's where we would look at those issues.
Okay. What about in a marriage when wife says, husband wanted sex all the time, woke me up in the middle of the night, was very demanding, forced it on me when I didn't want it. I can't tell you how common that is.
That is very common. Yes. And unfortunately, especially in family court, that stuff doesn't come out until it's divorce time. And people really don't realize how common that is amongst relationships and marriages. In that respect, especially if she used the word forced, then I would recommend a psychosexual evaluation. And for mom, I would recommend the psychological evaluation to look at. That's pretty traumatic. Do we have some trauma now going on in there? And how could that impact her ability to parent? And then dad's sexual behaviors, how does that impact the ability to parent?
I'm glad you brought that up. Let's segue. Let's say you have done your evaluation and you've determined, let's start with narcissism, because you're right, it comes up all the time. Let's say you determine someone is narcissistic. How should that impact a parenting time and legal decision-making award?
So with that, it depends on the degree of narcissism, because there are narcissistic adults who actually are very good parents because they see their children as extensions of themselves. So they will go to the ends of the world to make sure that kid's needs are met, because if that kid looks bad, then it reflects poorly on myself. It depends on the level of what's going on. And then there's different traits within narcissism that we would be looking at. If the person is truly self-centered and does not have that extension of the child of themselves, and they're really not looking at things from the child's best interest, that's when it could potentially impact parenting time and legal decision making, because they're not necessarily going to make decisions in favor for the child. They would make it in favor for themselves, and that impacts parenting.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I see a lot is when you have those people that sure as heck are on that spectrum, you can just tell they're on that narcissistic spectrum somehow, and they do parent on a day-to-day basis in a way that is normal. They take their kids to school, they get them dressed, they help them with homework, they care about their children, but they hate their ex. And so the decision making becomes very difficult, and the conflict doesn't ever seem to resolve.
Yes, that's where the co-parenting coaching and issues really need to occur. I'm a firm believer in co-parenting couples counseling after the relationship has ended, because if they're not able to put aside their differences and come to terms to do what's in the best interest of the child, that is a problem and will impact their parenting time. So having a frank decision, a frank talk with both parents and acknowledge, yes, this happens. We clearly don't like each other, but we produced these children together. Mm-hmm. And hopefully at that time when it happened, it was a loving, loving relationship. So at one time you both liked each other. So let's find that and then put aside everything else, act like adults. And how can we come to terms and co-parent appropriately? Easier said than done, but I do have a lot of parents that are able to do it. But it takes post-marriage therapy to do so.
I agree with you. I think it's a really valuable thing in the vast majority of relationships. Even when there's a narcissist, have you seen that work?
Yeah, again, it depends on the level of narcissism. But the trick with narcissism is trying to get them to see if they change their behavior, how does it benefit themselves?
Yeah.
So if you can figure out a way to like, this is actually benefiting you and it's in your best interest, they're more apt to do it. They're not going to
Okay.
do it for somebody else, but they
Yeah.
will do it for themselves.
Right.
So
Right.
that's where you need a really good couples therapist that
Yes.
that is skilled in that, but it can happen.
Okay. All right. Now let's say we've done the psychosexual and it comes back that father is engaged in deviant behavior. How does that impact parenting time and decision making?
So it depends on when they're doing it. So, and it also depends on the actual parenting inventories that we do as well. Because again, you can engage in these deviant behaviors and still be a good parent. It depends on when you're doing it and how it's impacting the life. So if it's consuming all of their time and to the point where it's potentially neglecting the child or not meeting the child's needs, then yes, that's going to negatively impact parenting time. So what I would want to go into first is say, okay, has the child been exposed to anything? If the child has not been exposed, and this is clearly, let's say, a closeted deviant behavior, then I would want to look at having dad get some treatment, if it is, assuming it's the dad, get some treatment, work through that, and then also increase the parenting time dependent on the progress of treatment. So it would really go of, what's the behavior going on and what's dad's willingness to address said behavior.
Okay. What does treatment typically look like?
Oh, this is good. So, because the problem is whatever comes back in court, and I've had lots of attorneys get upset when I say they need to go through sex treatment, because then they're like, my client's not a sex offender. Well, I'm not calling your client a sex offender. He's not convicted of sex offense. However, he has engaged in sexually deviant behavior that's potentially illegal and just happened to not get prosecuted.
Which happens all the time.
All the time.
All the time.
Yeah. So what the general public doesn't know is that the majority of sex offenses are actually not even reported. Mm-hmm. And of those reported, they're not even prosecuted. And the ones that win at prosecution is a very, very small percentage. So there are lots of Americans walking around that have either been the victim of a sex crime or have perpetrated a sex crime and have frankly just gotten away with it. And in the perpetrator has never had any consequences. So once we sort of come to that acknowledgement, and a lot of times that takes education on the professional's part to educate the court and the attorneys of these exact statistics that I'm referring to, then we say, okay, so in this case, we're saying dad, had dad been convicted of the crime, this is what the treatment would look like. Guess what? The treatment's going to be exactly the same. It doesn't matter if the person's convicted or not. So the treatment's going to look at, okay, what are the thinking errors or thought patterns that the individual utilized to justify it, that getting into doing that behavior? Because that's going to be the major thing that we're going to look at in therapy, because we need to change those thought patterns to help the person to develop a good, solid relapse prevention plan to ensure that because our thoughts drive our behaviors. So we also want to look at, okay, what led them down that road to begin with? A lot of pornography addictions actually start because they're feeling rejected by their partner. So, okay, we're all sexual beings. Everybody has sex needs met. If you don't have a healthy sexual relationship within your marriage, somebody's going to turn to either another person and have an affair, or some people really they have the judgment and they go, well, I don't want to have an affair because that's really wrong. I'm just going to start looking at porn. But then the problem is then they're looking at porn every night, and then even if the wife wants to have sex, they're choosing the porn over sex with the wife. And then we find ourselves in family court, because that just is a recipe for disaster if it never gets addressed. So part of the evaluation and also part of the therapist's job is to figure out the why. what drove this behavior to begin with. Okay, let's fix that. And that's really what treatment is all about.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense to me. It makes sense to me because this is like any other behavior that you want to change. It's really not that different from choosing to use drugs or choosing to, have an eating disorder or whatever your coping mechanism is. But we know that that type of cognitive behavior therapy and changing your habits won't work if you don't want to. So
Exactly.
court-ordered treatment for somebody who's like, I don't want to change my behavior doesn't seem like it would be effective.
It depends on their motivation, because I've had judges outright tell the parents, if you do not make progress in this, it is going to affect your parenting time and you seeing your children. I've had that happen in DCS court and in family court. And a lot of times that's the kind of little light bulb that needs to go off and be like, okay, obviously this is an issue.
Yeah.
So let's fix it, because otherwise I'm going to lose my kids.
How long does treatment usually last? Let's say somebody is super engaged. They fell into a porn addiction because they had a bad relationship, and now they want to have a healthy relationship moving forward. Yay them.
Yeah.
How long will that take?
It depends, but on average, like if they're super engaged and they're doing the work and it's a weekly basis, maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months. It depends on the other factors that are going on, because usually it's not just my wife stopped having sex with me. There was other stuff going on. What happens is the sex is really the red flag that everybody gets to talk about, but there's a lot of other stuff that came before that. So unraveling that and getting the person to accept responsibility for whatever dysfunction they brought to the relationship that might have led to their decision to then go and do this deviant behavior. That's where it can change the course of treatment and the length of time.
Okay. I want to transition a little bit to a harder topic.
Okay. Sorry.
I had a woman in my office who really wanted to get a divorce, and she suspected that her...
Sorry.
It's no problem. I can just edit it out.
Okay.
So I'll just start that part over.
Okay.
So I want to transition a little bit to a harder subject, at least for me. And that is when people suspect their children might be victims of sex abuse, but they have no evidence. So I had a woman who was in my office and she really wanted to get a divorce, and the relationship was not really safe.
Okay.
For her, but she suspected that her 4-year-old was the victim of child sex abuse by the dad. The only reasons were dad had been a victim of sex abuse when he was a child by an older cousin or something. And then the child had engaged in some behavior that seemed abnormal to the mom. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but some of it didn't seem abnormal to me. I have 3 boys, and so they do a lot of touching, and that didn't seem weird to me. But for some parents, they might think that's super weird.
Yes.
So I had to tell her, listen, if you really think that your child is a victim of sex abuse by your husband, I do not recommend you move out, because at this point, we don't have enough evidence at all for a judge to take your hunch seriously. So please tell me what I can be doing differently and what these parents can do to suss out whether or not they have an issue.
So this is where it's important for especially family law attorneys to have a basic knowledge of normative sexual development and sexual behaviors. We as humans are sexualized beings, especially under the age of 5. People don't want to talk about it, and they certainly don't want to acknowledge it. But the issue is when adults look at especially the under 5 behaviors, they sexualize it and they think has to do something with arousal. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It is body exploration, which is normal development. So and then as the person ages, as the child ages, normal, can widen of what's appropriate and what's potentially a red flag for being exposed to sex too early. So this is where it's really helpful for attorneys to have that basic knowledge and have education by someone like myself or any other sex therapist that can teach them about, okay, this is what's considered normal. So then they can calm their clients and say, nope, this is that's normal, but just keep an eye on it and see if anything else happens or whatnot, and try to calm the parent. The overwhelming majority of adults never had, especially now, never had proper sex education. Nobody ever really sits down and teaches people, okay, from birth to 2, this is what we're going to see the person engaging in that's considered normal body exploration, things like that. And this is what happens from 2 to 5, and this is what happens from 6 to 10. Nobody has that course. So unless you work in this field, it's literally just not common knowledge. It should be, because a lot of this stuff would save a lot of resources, frankly, because we do have some parents that instead of calling their divorce attorney, they're calling the police. And now we're opening up a full police investigation off of what is literally normative child development. And that's a waste of resources, especially during this time. So I think it's really important for attorneys to have that. And if they don't, this is where you have you can send your client to somebody like myself or a sex therapist, so they can have one session of like, okay, this is what we're looking for, and keep an eye on this and go from there and see what happens. So that's one part. I have another part. So the suspicion that because somebody was sexually abused as a child, research has proven over and over again, just because you were sexually abused as a child does not make you an offender. The actually overwhelming amount of convicted sex offenders as adults were never sexually abused as a child. So that right there, that misinformation that the general public has is very problematic, because it's just false.
That is such helpful information, because that is a pervasive theme of, so-and-so never processed what happened to them, and therefore I think they're a danger or whatnot.
Yeah.
So that is such crucial information. Let's talk for just a minute about what is normal and when your child's behavior should set off alarms, and what to do when you're on the fence, because we don't really want to invite DCS into our homes unnecessarily. Like, right. If it were my children, I would want to figure it out myself. I would not want to call DCS in. So tell me, like, what do we look for? What are red flags, and what do we do?
So red flags we're looking at is the child engaging in these behaviors? Let's say if they're school aged and they're engaging in these behaviors at school, that could be potentially a red flag, because they should be focused on school. So, okay, they're clearly distracted by some sort of sexual behavior. And in normative sexual development, those behaviors don't necessarily occur at school. So we're looking at that, and same thing at daycare. The problem is for birth to 5, we have just lots of body exploration, touching themselves. And, I see lots of daycare kids, lying face down on the floor, especially boys. And they're sort of like, rubbing like this, and they're stimulating themselves. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's a form of masturbation, but it's not the same as what we would
right.
conceptualize it as adults. But that's them getting to learn their bodies. But it's up to the adults to, teach them and mold that behavior and say, no, that's not appropriate to do in the middle of the classroom, and things like that. In terms of, playing doctor, again, there's lots of that goes on. I actually do a lot of psychosexual evaluations on juveniles for these things. What we're looking at there is age differences, cognitive ability. So, if one might be older, but let's say a lower functioning, then they're really functioning at the younger age. So is the behavior fitting in with what we would expect for normal development there? Anything that has to do with porn is going to be a red flag. there. Unfortunately, now the average age for looking at porn first being exposed is age 10, which is fourth grade, which it's only going to get younger, unfortunately, with the internet. So we do have kids that are talking about porn at school because maybe they had an older brother that showed it to them, and then they talk about it at school. So then this kid comes home and, Googles the word sex, and then all of a sudden mom is saying, oh, that you got that at dad's house. Well, no, the majority is that's at school, that's within normal stuff. This is where we have to now have a chat with, okay, what is in this house? What are we going to talk about for our sexual beliefs? What's okay? At age 10, pornography is never okay. So having them be exposed to sex that early, that's never a good thing. So we want to have an open conversation about that. Possibly find out the other children that are in the school that are where the kid found that stuff out. But the bigger issue is that the general public doesn't tend to know these things. So again, it's looking at, okay, get more facts and find out what other potential areas this kid was exposed to, and not maybe just at dad's house. Because a lot of stuff happens at school. Myself and another doctor in a practice, we consult with a lot of schools because there's a whole lot of porn being looked at school when they should be in math class. So it does happen. And that's really the early introduction. It's not that the kid is being sexually abused by the other parent. It's that they're going to school and looking at porn. So if the child outright says something of like, they're not comfortable going over to dad's house, we want to find out why, what they don't like about it. If there's hesitation, if we're looking at behavior changes, let's say they go to dad's on the weekend, if the child becomes very, kind of emotional, or maybe super distant, or we see a change in their behavior right before or right after, those are red flags that something's potentially going on at that house that's making that child uncomfortable. We would want to look at that. So there's really a lot of red flags to look for, unfortunately. So it's a matter of being a good detective and figuring that stuff out.
So hard, depending on the age, because I think if you've got a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old, you can probably I would probably have them show up at your office.
Yeah,
make an appointment, be like, you figure it out.
Yeah, and some parents do that if they just want a consultation or for therapy or whatnot before we get police involved or things like that. The nice thing about going to a therapist, we are mandated reporters. So if the child discloses something, it is going to get reported. But otherwise, if they don't, it stays private and within the family. That happens. That can happen a lot. So it's really kind of figuring out, okay, what's this child normally like? And what is normal development? And then what are the changes that we're seeing compared to both of those things?
Okay. We could talk about this for so long. Another thing that comes up a lot that is really hard on families is when families are divorced and blended, and there comes an allegation where a step child is abusing or sexually acting out with a child. What do you suggest under those circumstances?
Okay, I do those evaluations at least once a week. Like, that's how common this is. So in that respect, it's not the parents getting the evaluation, it's the older child. And we would, depending on the age, do a psychosexual evaluation or a psychological evaluation if they're under 10. We don't really do psychosexual evaluations below the age of 10, but we would still look at the behavior and whatnot. But in terms of the actual sex test and things like that, most of them start at age 12. So we would be doing the evaluation on that child and figuring out, okay, what's going on here, what's already happened, and then to get that kid in the treatment. The majority of kids, the overwhelming majority of kids that engage in sexually abusive behaviors Once they get caught, they never go on and do it again, even in the absence of treatment. Treatment really just helps to solidify that it's not going to happen again, and helps to teach them healthy relationships, and really addresses the reason, the why for the behavior. Again, we're going back to the why, because usually there's something else going on for that child, and it's not necessarily, a sex addiction as and they have to have sex. There's something else going on, that sex was fulfilling that need, and that's what we would address in the treatment.
I think this is worth us taking a second on, because what you just said is, when teens or tweens are engaged in sexually deviant behavior, the vast majority of the time that behavior can be corrected.
Yes.
It is the impulse that parents have to hide it that is much more problematic than calling it out and addressing it, because teens make dumb decisions.
Yes, all the time.
All the time, in every aspect. But when they make patterned decisions, when this becomes a coping mechanism, or that is dangerous. The reason I say that is because parents are afraid their kids are going to go to jail. Parents are afraid that they are going to be labeled. Parents are afraid they're going to lose parenting time with their other children. And so this becomes something that shuts families down.
Yes. And unfortunately, in some cases, some or all of those things happen. But it really depends on how early you address it, and what happens. Unfortunately, some of the juveniles, they are going to get prosecuted. That's just it. I mean, I hold a state contract for doing juvenile probation psychosexual evaluations. So and the vast majority of those, the victims are younger siblings or step siblings or somebody else in the house. And they do have those legal consequences. That said, that does not mean they're going to go on to be an adult offender. The nice part about getting the legal system involved is it then opens up a door to a vast array of services to make sure that this kid gets the help that they need. Versus if you took it in-house, you might not get the same services because maybe you can't afford that. A lot of us don't take insurance because insurance doesn't cover a lot of this type of therapy, because of the duration it takes to fix it. So you got to pay out of pocket. A lot of people don't have that kind of money. To see a psychologist for therapy, you're looking at $150 to $200 an hour. You're going to do that once a week. That's a lot of money. That's a car payment for some people. So, if you can't use your insurance, then the child's not going to get the help that they need. Then the behavior is going to continue, and then it becomes more problematic. So, and when you look at it that way, sometimes having the legal system involved is actually better, because probation will ensure that this kid gets the help that they need and the services that they need to. And if they do probation correctly, they can petition to get their record expunged. In the state of Arizona, records are automatically expunged at age 18, like other states are. So that does have to be a petition and get an absolute discharge. But there's many kids that do, and they go on to live very productive lives. I provided treatment to a number of kids that are now adults, and they are very successful, gone to college, graduated, have families of their own, and are doing really well. And they made at age 11 or 12 did something very inappropriate, but guess what? That doesn't mean they're going to do that behavior when they're 26. So we need to make sure that they get the service that they need so we can fix the behavior. It's the same thing as substance abuse. What's interesting is parents are more likely to talk about and be okay with, oh, my kid has a drug problem. Well, right. We have to look at sex as just another drug.
Right.
Because it does, especially pornography, impacts the brain very similar to cocaine. We have lots of research on that. So when you think about it as, well, if I look at this as a drug problem, that's okay. We're going to do the treatment. And as long as we keep them sober, we're going to be fine. right? There's plenty of people that are recovering alcoholics that are very successful individuals. There are plenty of people that are not. Well, same thing with sex offending.
Right, right. But
So
certainly the earlier you intervene, the more likely you are to be successful.
yes, exactly. So, but there are a number of times where the kids don't get prosecuted. I actually just finished up a case where it was parents that called me. They did the right thing. They did call DCS immediately because it was a blended family, and it was, you know, the adopted son against the new half sister. And that happens a lot, but DCS didn't take the case because the parents did everything they could. They set up a good safety plan, put cameras up, and did everything they needed to do to protect both children. So DCS said, okay, and they moved on.
Yeah.
Police, you did everything you needed to do. We're going to look at this. The county attorney, for whatever reason, didn't want to prosecute. Move on. Get the kid help. Okay, now I do come in and do the evaluation. Say, okay, this is everything that's going on. Here's the treatment. Get him this, and he should be fine.
I have one more question. So if let's take that situation, which is pretty common. You've got
Yes.
2 children, you're looking at protecting all of them. If DCS is fairly easy to work around, you have to take steps to make sure and ensure and show that your children are safe. That might mean separating them. It might
Yes.
mean you never have them on the same parenting time. It might mean cameras. It might mean all sorts of things. That's fairly easy. If you want your child in treatment, and that involves them making admissions that can be used against them criminally, how does that work? Can they get treatment that is confidential?
Yes, because if it's already been reported to the police and the police have now decide for whatever reason not press charges, then it's fine. Then it's completely confidential, and you're the owner of their medical records. So it's just like going to therapy any other time. And, you know, I'm not going to disclose these records to anyone else without your permission. And that's typically what happens.
And criminally, can the criminal court get your records?
No, not without a subpoena or the parent pulling it, signing a release to allow it to be released.
It's quite the conundrum.
It is, and it's really a gamble. But for parents that are in there, the biggest issue is protecting both children, because one definitely made a very bad mistake, but we have to realize that they're a child and it's a mistake. They're going to make mistakes. Unfortunately, some of the mistakes have bigger consequences than others. But we still have to remember that child has emotional needs and needs to be parented and loved and protected just as much as the victim. We should not be choosing one child over the other. And that's where it becomes really hard of ensuring the safety for both. And this is where consulting with a professional to help set up a safety plan, getting each child in treatment as what they need to do, that is very, very important to do. And for parenting time, a lot of times we recommend, okay, let's just flip-flop the parenting time, and these kids are never together. That's the bonus part of a blended family, especially if we have the step siblings, because they're like, okay, this one is that when Johnny is with dad, well, then Sally is with her dad. So they're just never together on the same weekend. You know, we just kind of work around the parenting time that way to ensure that they are not together while the kids are going through treatment. Eventually, ideally, what happens is then we do victim clarification, where the perpetrator and the victim do treatment together to repair that relationship. And then we help bring the family in and get everybody on the same page and fix the family relationship and family dynamic. And then we go on and hopefully everybody resolves everything and we're healthy. That's the goal, is to have a healthy family relationship, whatever that may look like.
Well, Dr. Leclerc, this has been a fantastic and tremendous episode. I really appreciate your time, your knowledge, your frank discussion. Make sure that you like and subscribe to the Modern Divorce Podcast. Let us know what other questions you have. If you have questions for Dr. Leclerc, send them in. I would love to have her on again. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.